When people list the defining aircraft of the Vietnam War, they say helicopter, they say F-4 Phantom, they say B-52. Nobody says Cessna. But between 1962 and 1975, a two-seat propeller plane built for weekend flying controlled more American firepower over Southeast Asia than any other aircraft in the sky. 338 of the men who flew it were killed. 469 of the aircraft were shot down. 2 pilots received the Medal of Honor, both posthumously. The Bird Dog did not drop bombs, did not fire missiles, and could not exceed highway speed. Every bomb that landed on the right target did so because this aircraft found it first. Almost nobody includes it in the story. Vietnam broke the playbook from the first week. In Europe and Korea, air power had worked because you could see the battlefield. You had front lines. You had armies that moved in the open. Fighter bombers had something to aim at. Vietnam had none of that. Triple canopy jungle rising over 100 feet blanketed everything below. An enemy mixed with farmers, wearing civilian clothes, moving at night, hiding in holes so small and so well concealed that infantry standing 2 yards away could not find them. Fighter bombers screaming overhead at 400 knots could not distinguish a tree line full of North Vietnamese Army regulars from a tree line full of rice farmers. They could not see where their own troops ended and the enemy began. The numbers made that failure official. The Office of the Secretary of Defense determined that roughly 4,300 of the 11,400 tactical air sorties flown per month in South Vietnam were targeting suspected enemy locations. Suspected. The Joint Chiefs of Staff described these missions plainly, less valuable than direct support. The U.S. Air Force was, in large measure, bombing holes in the jungle. The cost of that failure was not measured in wasted ordnance. Military historians estimate 3,000 to 4,000 U.S. troops killed by their own side's air power in Vietnam. A study of a single battalion from the 101st Airborne Division found that more than 13% of battlefield casualties came from friendly fire, a figure that climbed by 50% during offensive operations in broken terrain. Something had to bridge the gap between the men on the ground who could see the enemy and the jets overhead who could not. On February 24, 1967, a captain in a 2-seat Cessna saw something through the jungle canopy that a battalion of ARVN Rangers walking below could not. What he did next, with no weapons, no backup, and 2 months left before he was scheduled to go home, is coming. But first, you need to understand what that tiny aircraft actually was. The name came from a Cessna employee named Jack Swayze, who won a company contest to christen the aircraft in 1950. He chose Bird Dog because that was the mission. A bird dog finds the quarry, circles, and holds position until the hunter arrives. Swayze understood the job better than any engineering specification ever could. The aircraft itself began as the Cessna Model 305A, winner of a 1950 U.S. Army competition against 3 other manufacturers. The Army wanted an all-metal, 2-seat observation monoplane to replace the fabric-covered L-4 Grasshoppers that had served in the Second World War. What Cessna delivered weighed less than a Honda Civic at maximum takeoff weight, 2,430 pounds, and was powered by a Continental 0470 flat-6 engine producing 213 horsepower. It looked and sounded like a private pilot's weekend aircraft. That was the point. It had a maximum speed of 115 miles per hour. That is a modern highway speed limit. It sounds like a liability, and from a fighter pilot's perspective, it was laughable. But over a Vietnamese jungle at 100 feet, 115 miles per hour meant a man with binoculars could read boot prints in the mud, spot the disturbed vegetation above a freshly dug spider hole, and notice that the river crossing downstream had silted up differently than it had the day before. The jets above were moving too fast to see any of that. The Bird Dog was slow enough to learn the ground. 4 hours and 40 minutes of loiter time. An F-4 Phantom burned through its fuel allowance over a target in minutes. The Bird Dog could orbit the same grid square for nearly 5 hours, which meant the pilots who flew it didn't just pass over their sector, they memorized it. They flew the same valleys and tree lines daily, cataloging what was normal so they could recognize what wasn't. A trail that hadn't been there yesterday. A cluster of footprints near a stream crossing that showed heavy traffic, from a direction that made no civilian sense. A row of vegetables growing in a supposedly uninhabited area. These weren't intelligence reports, they were facts visible only at low speed, low altitude, and sustained attention. It could get airborne from a dirt road, 560 feet of takeoff roll over a 50-foot obstacle. It operated from 68 forward locations across South Vietnam, many of them nothing more than a compacted field hacked out of the jungle. But the feature that made it irreplaceable had nothing to do with airframe or engine. It carried 5 separate radios. Ground troops communicated on FM frequencies, what soldiers called Fox Mike. Fighter bombers flew on UHF. Command elements, air traffic control, and tactical operations centers used VHF. These 3 worlds could not talk to each other. A platoon pinned down in a tree line, and the Phantoms orbiting overhead were, electronically speaking, strangers. Without the forward air controller and the Bird Dog, they had no common language. He was the only man in the battle space who could hear all 3 worlds and speak to all 3 worlds. The limitation was brutal. Only one radio could transmit at a time. While he was talking to the ground troops on FM, he wasn't talking to the fighters on UHF. While he was briefing the jets, the men on the ground were shouting into a receiver he wasn't monitoring. He juggled 5 radio control heads, managed attack runs, read topographic maps he'd marked up with a grease pencil on the windscreen, and scanned the ground for threats, all at once. The forward air controller's workload was staggering in a way that had no equivalent in any other aircrew assignment. The radio the forward air controller wasn't monitoring during Willbanks' final passes, the one that couldn't reach the overhead command aircraft on UHF, is part of that story too. Its only armament was smoke. 4 hardpoints under the wings, each carrying a 2 3/4-inch rocket fitted with a white phosphorus warhead. Soldiers called them Willie Pete. The forward air controller fired one and called "Hit my smoke" over UHF, then cleared the area. The rocket did not kill anyone. It produced a dense white plume, visible from altitude through the jungle canopy, a burning column of smoke that told a Phantom pilot exactly where to put his ordnance. Captain Robert J. Moriarty of Marine Observation Squadron 5 Mo 6 described it with the precision of a man who had thought about it carefully. He said the O-1 was the slowest aircraft in the Marine inventory, flew the lowest, drew the most fire, and was by far the deadliest plane we used. Every word of that was connected. The speed that made it vulnerable was the same quality that made it lethal. February 24, 1967, late afternoon, Lam Dong Province, Central Highlands. Captain Hilliard A. Willbanks, callsign Walt 5-1, was flying visual reconnaissance ahead of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, 23rd Ranger Battalion along Highway QL-20 outside the town of Di Linh. He was assigned to the 21st Tactical Air Support Squadron out of Nha Trang Air Base. 487 combat missions behind him. 2 months left on his tour. He was a man who had done the math and was almost through it. From the Bird Dog cockpit at low altitude, Willbanks saw what the Rangers below could not see. Viet Cong positions, carefully concealed, were dug into the hilltops on both sides of the open tea plantation. The column was about to walk through. Local workers had been forced to dig the positions overnight. The ambush was prepared and waiting. He radioed a warning. The Viet Cong, realizing their ambush had been spotted, made a decision. Open fire now. Mortars, machine guns, automatic weapons struck at both the Bird Dog and the Rangers at the same time. Then the attackers came out of the foxholes with bayonets fixed and charged downhill through the tea plantation toward the outnumbered Ranger Battalion. Willbanks did the arithmetic. Fighter aircraft were 20 to 40 minutes away. The Rangers had less than that. He dove the O-1 directly at the charging enemy and fired his white phosphorus rockets into the mass of men. The advance halted. The white smoke drifted through the plantation. Then the Viet Cong recognized what had just happened. The Bird Dog was out of rockets. The advance resumed. Willbanks picked up his M16 rifle. He dropped the nose, came down to 100 feet, and began strafing runs, releasing the controls, firing out the side window, pulling off, reloading, and coming back around. This was not a suicidal impulse. Willbanks understood the geometry of the situation better than any option he had left. A charging infantry formation breaks when something is diving at it and making noise. Not because it is guaranteed lethal, but because the human mind cannot process incoming threat fast enough to distinguish between certain death and near death. He bought time by being incomprehensible, an unarmed forward air controller in a Cessna making attack runs with a rifle. On the third pass, concentrated Viet Cong fire struck the Bird Dog. The aircraft crashed between the opposing forces. An ARVN Ranger ran across the fire, swept ground, and pulled the unconscious Willbanks from the wreckage. Helicopter gunships attempted 4 landings in the kill zone. 4 times, Viet Cong ground fire drove them off. Under another forward air controller's direction, 2 F-4 Phantoms raked the enemy positions. A helicopter finally landed and extracted Willbanks. He died en route to Bao Loc. The Rangers got out. Secretary of the Air Force Harold Brown presented the Medal of Honor to Willbanks' widow Rosemary on January 24, 1968. He was the first forward air controller in Air Force history to receive it. The war had other stories. On the night of December 19, 1970, Lieutenant John Browning of the 20th Tactical Air Support Squadron lifted off from Da Nang at 22:15 hours, climbing to 8,500 feet in an O-2A Skymaster, the Bird Dog's twin-engine replacement. His call sign was Covey 281. He killed his navigation lights crossing the Laotian border, unsynced his propellers to confuse enemy sound detection, and checked in with Moonbeam, the orbiting EC-130 command aircraft that managed night operations over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then he directed his first strikes against truck traffic at a road junction in the Ban Bac sector. The initial bombs hit something beneath the jungle canopy that no one had known was there. 28 secondary explosions tore through the foliage in minutes. 7 large fires lit the darkness. Browning radioed Moonbeam with the understatement of the war. "You're not going to believe what's going on down here." Covey forward air controllers maintained continuous coverage for 10 days. They flew over 300 hours through anti-aircraft fire from 23mm, 37mm, and 57mm guns. 6,500 secondary explosions were counted. Not a single forward air controller was lost. It was the largest and most successful single interdiction operation ever executed against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was started by 1 lieutenant in a propeller aircraft at 22:15 hours on a Tuesday. In Laos, the war had a different name and a different set of rules, which is to say almost none. Captain Craig W. Duering reported to Long Ting Air Base in Military Region 2 in the spring of 1970 as a newly assigned Raven forward air controller, one of a classified program that never exceeded 22 pilots at its peak. The Ravens flew unmarked aircraft in civilian clothes, operating under CIA direction and the authority of the U.S. Ambassador to Laos. Their mission was to support General Vang Pao's Hmong guerrilla army against NVA forces that outnumbered and outgunned every position the Hmong held. On Duering's orientation flight, his first day, his Hmong observer Yang Bi leaned forward in the rear seat and warned that they had to go to Lima Site 26 now, many enemy forces attacking right now. Duering protested that it was his first day. Yang Bi replied that no other Ravens were airborne and that they had to go quickly. Duering confirmed it. He was the only Raven in the sky. He called Cricket, the orbiting airborne command and control aircraft, requested fighters, and flew to a besieged outpost under ground fire so intense he later described the sky as filled with everything that existed. He flew 4 sorties, 9 hours and 10 minutes of combat time, with an estimated 150 enemy killed. Lima Site 26 held. The Distinguished Flying Cross was awarded to Captain Duering for his actions on day 1. He went on to fly 834 combat missions as the longest-serving Raven forward air controller at Long Ting. Military historians assess, and American veteran accounts from every theater confirm, that NVA and VC units observed a disciplined practice of withholding fire against observation aircraft. Not out of sentimentality, out of arithmetic. Fire at the Cessna and you reveal your position. A white phosphorus smoke plume appears within minutes, visible from 5 miles. Within 20 minutes, F-4 Phantoms roll in with 750-pound bombs and napalm. One burst of ground fire trades your dug-in position, your weapons cache, your entire unit's survival, for a chance to down an unarmed observation aircraft. Concealment beats that trade every single time. Marshall Harrison, a forward air controller pilot who flew extensively in the Mekong Delta, wrote that NVA and VC soldiers had a name for forward air controller aircraft. They called them bringers of death. The clearest proof that this fear was real came after the war, when documents and debriefs confirmed what engineers had already begun building in response: the Y-03 A Quiet Star, a purpose-designed near-silent observation aircraft that was acoustically undetectable at 1,000 feet. The U.S. military spent development money to build a silent forward air controller aircraft for one reason only: because NVA troops were using the sound of the O-1's Continental engine as an early warning system. When they heard it coming, they stopped moving, hid, and waited. The answer to why build a silent forward air controller aircraft is simple. The enemy was already listening for the one you had. The practice of listening did not make the bird dog safe to attack. It made attacking it irrational. What was rational did not always determine outcomes. 469 O-1 bird dogs were lost in Vietnam, to all causes. The aircraft's aluminum skin stopped nothing. Standard .30 caliber rifle fire could bring it down. By 1966, bird dogs were being driven out of the areas near the DMZ by anti-aircraft concentrations too dense for a slow propeller aircraft to survive. When the SA-7 Strela shoulder-fired heat-seeking missile appeared in May of 1972, the era of slow, low observation flying over defended territory effectively ended. 3 O-1 bird dogs were confirmed lost to Strelas. The physics had changed. The Raven forward air controllers in Laos flew until the program ended knowing the numbers. Craig Deering calculated them precisely. 50% of Raven pilots were wounded or killed, 90% of planes were hit by ground fire, 30% were killed in action. Of roughly 198 Ravens who served the program, 23 Air Force pilots and 1 Army attaché were killed. 3 remain missing. Deering, who had calculated those numbers from the inside, described the sky over his sector in a single sentence: "All the fires in the world were coming at me." The bird dog's doctrine survived the bird dog. The 9-line targeting brief, the cleared hot authorization, the requirement for positive terminal control of ordnance near friendly forces, meaning that no strike pilot could release weapons without the direct radio authorization of a controller who had visually confirmed the target and the friendly positions. These procedures, developed and paid for in blood over Vietnam's triple canopy, became the foundation of modern close air support coordination. Every joint terminal attack controller in Afghanistan and Iraq, calling in strikes with ground forces meters from the target, was working within a framework traced directly to what FAC pilots in O-1 bird dogs had built from first principles over the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands. When Raven FAC Captain Greg Wilson requested a post-war fighter assignment, the Pentagon told him they were trying to purge the Vietnam FAC experience from the fighter corps. The institutional knowledge accumulated at that cost was deliberately set aside. It had to be relearned in subsequent wars. SOG veteran John L. Plaster, whose reconnaissance teams inserted into Laos were extracted under Covey FAC air cover more times than he cared to count, described what it meant to hear that engine. No matter how dire the situation, you only needed to hear Covey's approaching engines to know all was not lost. An engine sound. That's what survival felt like. Which brings it back to the soldier in the tree line, keeping absolutely still, hearing the Continental O-470 somewhere above the canopy, that flat, slightly rough drone that carried through jungle at low altitude and announced itself well before the aircraft was visible, waiting for the sound to fade, staying motionless until it did. The most feared aircraft in Vietnam made a noise like a lawnmower, and every soldier in the jungle on both sides of the fight knew exactly what it meant.